Scott. Welcome to 2025 and our third season of Prescription for Better Access podcast. How are you today?
Doing great, Mark. Good to see you. Time flies when you're having fun.
No doubt, no doubt. Why are you not wearing your Buckeyes helmet?
It was an auspicious season, obviously, for all of us here in Columbus, and we're mighty happy about the outcome of the game there and the future for our Buckeyes.
There we go. Well, we recorded last where they just had lost to Michigan, so it was not looking as good.
That's right. It's a good bounce back.
It is. Well, we have a great guest to kick off 2025, truly one of the industry leaders. And we're just thrilled to have Sarah Emond join us, who's the president of ICER. And in our industry, obviously, everybody knows ICER and what they do and the importance. But we're excited to have Sarah join us today.
It's really my pleasure to be here. I love your podcast, and I feel honored that I get to be the first guest of 2025. Thank you both.
Well, welcome, Sarah.
Well, great. Well, we're going to start off easy. We'd love it if you just sort of give us a little bit of brief introduction to your background, and obviously you took over for Steve, and who was the founder of ICER. So I'm sure that's been an exciting transition. So help us catch us up to speed with where we are.
Well, I'd be happy to, and it's interesting. I've always been interested in health. I studied biology in college. I was pre-med, actually thought about a career in medicine. And I often tell people that when you have those interests, you think there's 5 things you can be when you grow up: doctor, nurse, veterinarian, dentist. And I was so excited to discover over the years, there's this whole other really cool thing called health policy, which turned out to be my passion. But it took a little while to find it. I actually worked in clinical research at an academic medical center for a few years. I did corporate communications for biopharmaceutical companies, both at a consulting firm and then as an in-house corporate communications specialist. And I figured out what I liked and what I didn't like about the different parts of my job, and realized that, oh, wow, this whole government affairs thing, like when people are talking about the policies that impact the entire environment in which we develop drugs, price drugs, get access to drugs, I realized I had found my thing. And so I spent some time at the Heller School at Brandeis getting a master's in public policy so that I could get the expertise I needed to speak the lingo, to translate that passion into actual ability to do the job. And after I graduated from graduate school, got introduced to Steve Pearson, who had just created this crazy idea of doing health technology assessment in the U.S. And I joined ICER in 2009.
Fantastic. And so, Sarah, if you just reflect on the first year since you've taken over at the helm, what stands out for you?
I really have been thrilled with the honor that I really do feel being president and CEO is, after working with Steve for so many years and helping him sort of build this idea into an actual 501c3 nonprofit. It was quite the honor to have been tapped to take over. I think the first year has gone really well. Steve and I did a lot of work with our board to plan the transition and his role in the transition, because it was so important that all of his contributions as founder continue. And so Steve has been a special advisor over the last year plus. It's been a tremendous asset to be able to have him as part of our strategic conversations and thinking about what the future holds for value assessment, drug pricing, especially going into a new administration. And so I think the first year I told people, if you're going to have a first CEO job, it's not a bad idea to have it in a place that you've worked for 15 years, because you kind of know all the things you tried and the things that worked and the things that didn't. And so I credit that to why we think it's gone as smoothly as it has, but it's also such an amazing team. My senior management team is fantastic. Many of them have been here for many, many years. And that great counsel we've been able to get from Steve has helped a ton.
Yeah, fantastic to hear. What any particular key milestones or accomplishments from the past year that stand out for you?
I think that for us, the implementation of a lot of the changes we made to our value assessment framework back in 2023, it was a big year for that, whether it was our clinical trial diversity rating tool, some additional work we were doing with patients, patient engagement, the launch of our patient council. Those things really were getting a lot of momentum over the last year. And I was really pleased to see that. You both know, and a lot of your listeners know, that the public dialogue that we try to foster around these issues is a core part of our mission. And so despite all the things that might be happening in the broader environment, we have felt really privileged to be able to continue to have those important and consequential conversations in a public setting. And so I think those are some of the things I'm really excited about. And we've been laying the groundwork for some new projects that we're going to be taking on this year, which I think we're going to talk about today too.
Well, why don't we start there? Because that's a great way to sort of look ahead. What you mentioned that 2025 is obviously you've got a lot accomplished in the last year, but what does 2025 have ahead of us for what you're doing?
I think that one of the things we're excited about is the recent announcement of a new launch price and access report. And this is a culmination of a lot of work that we have been doing over the years. Our bread and butter is still the comparative effectiveness review that is on a particular condition, usually anchored by a new approval, sometimes looking at additional drugs that have been in the space and having a conversation about what the evidence tells us about how well it works and what the price should be. That's not going away. But we've always had this other option or other avenue, which is these other types of policy reports that can foster a conversation about how we get to our ultimate mission of the fair price, fair access, and the future innovation. And for a while, we were doing an unsupported price increase report. We were trying to take a look to see when price increases were happening without any evidence that the drug was actually working better. Because like the fundamental idea of ICER's approach is pay a lot for drugs that work really well and don't pay so much for drugs that don't work that well. And so, yeah, if you get new evidence that your drug works, cool. That price hike might be justified. And so we had that project for a little while. We also had a few years of looking at barriers to fair access. We codified in a white paper what the ethical guideposts should be for prescription drug coverage policy. What should PBMs and payers do about step therapy, about clinical eligibility? And we've been putting out those reports. Those reports really had a purpose, and I think they ran their course. And what we decided to do is take some of the spirit from those reports into a new area of launch price and access, because we have identified launch price and launch price trends as a really important part of the conversation about price and access that we think we have something unique to contribute to. And one of those things is we have expertise in analyzing and understanding the net price. We've all seen launch price reports that talk about the trends from a list price perspective, but we know that's not really telling us the story, right? With the rebates and the pressure for higher and higher prices because they want bigger and bigger rebates. And what does it actually mean for patients has been kind of left out. And so we expect this report to be looking at trends from a net price basis over a period of time. We might look at things like accelerated approval versus not, orphan drug versus not, maybe therapeutic class. So that's one idea that's bubbling about how we'll do this. We're also going to take a look at the drugs that were launched that we analyzed, because sometimes our reports come out before the price, right? Before the FDA approval. So now we have a chance to go back and say, which companies did a good job of matching the price to the value and which companies missed the mark? And what does that mean for us as a society from an opportunity cost perspective? What did we miss out on being able to do because we had this misalignment between the price and the value? So we want to be able to tell that story. And importantly, the third big part of this is telling that access story. And we know that what you can see in a coverage policy or what you can read written down or the statement from the health plan often doesn't match the experience that patients have trying to get access to the care they need. Why is that? What's getting in the way? Is it cost sharing? Is it plan design? Is it clinical eligibility? Is it the price? And so the access piece is going to be really important. And I got to tell you, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet because we're in the early stages of talking to our working group about this. but we expect that there will be those three prongs of this new launch price and access report.
You mentioned that one of the big things you did was obviously you've become much closer to the patient community, which again, you're to be applauded for those efforts. And I know that there's still this, there's still sort of a give and take here in terms of how much involvement and how much role you have to be independent. So we understand the sort of those dynamics. But I think you mentioned in the launch prices and access report that what else could it be? And I know in the patient community, again, this is the hat that I wear really on this podcast, is what could those barriers be? Like how bad those are those sort of barriers being erected? How high are they getting? And how much is that stopping patients from getting access? Can you go into a little bit more detail about, some of those challenges, and how do you truly get a handle on where the true barriers are?
Well, you've hit it, Mark, because the issue is it's so opaque. Sometimes we can't actually see the extent of the barriers that are getting between patients and the drugs that they need. So we know that there have been some creative new programs like copay accumulators and copay maximizers that are playing a role in access, and a lot of surprise in terms of what the cost sharing is for the patient community. We know that from year to year, the preferred drug for your particular condition could change based on the negotiations between the payer, the PBM, and the manufacturer. And that doesn't always mean that you get to stay on the drug that's been working for you, because they don't have really good policies for, continuation of coverage. Some do. I'm not saying that's across the board, but, that's what we're seeing. We're also seeing a trend in the benefit design of more and more costs being shifted to those who actually need access to the healthcare system in order to keep the premiums lower for everybody. And I get it. As effectively a small business owner, we get the renewal every year about how much our health insurance premiums are going up. And I understand when employers are facing with higher costs and a decision between what's the benefit going to look like so that I can keep this affordable for everyone. And sometimes the high deductible plan or the plan where all the drugs are on a co-insurance is one of the only ways that I can afford to offer health insurance if I'm a small or medium-sized employer. And so we know that ends up asking people who have chronic conditions to subsidize the cost of health insurance for healthy people, which is literally the opposite of what health insurance is supposed to do, right? It's really the other way around. So these are the things that we have learned in our journey of working with patients and patient groups, that some of us have experienced in our own journey with the healthcare system, that we don't shy away from highlighting when they end up being that barrier to access that, the patients didn't ask to get rheumatoid arthritis. Just because there were shenanigans with the rebates on Humira and other things doesn't mean they're the ones that should have to switch every year from a drug that's working for them for one that's not. Those are some of the lessons that we've learned.
Interesting. Do you have a sense from the body of work over the many years, Sarah, perspective, and especially in the last few years, perhaps, about what you think overall the pricing trends are for the industry, and list and net, and maybe some of the drivers behind that? There's a lot of misunderstanding about those things.
There really is. And I'll have a better answer for you in Q4 when the report is out. Right. But I mean, from what we've been seeing, you can take this in a couple of ways. One is if we're looking on an individual drug basis, if you look at the body of work that we've done, about 75% of the time, manufacturers are picking prices above the value-based price benchmark. So 25% of the time, they're right in there. Mm-hmm. So if we're thinking about de-escalating this arms race between higher and higher prices and more and more access restrictions, we need to be thinking about the price decisions as a first step. And so that's definitely part of what we have seen in the body of work. But we're also, and I've been doing this work, I first entered industry in 2000. And so I've been doing this work long enough when I remember that $50,000 a year, $75,000 a year was a large enough price to say, that's great. It's going to incentivize the next round of innovation that I need. And then all of a sudden that price became 300,000, 500,000. Now, there were a lot of policy changes that were happening to explain some of that. More incentives for rare conditions with smaller patient populations where the price might need to be higher in order to recoup your costs and incentivize additional research. But I also think there was just something that was happening because of the way that this market is structured and all of its dysfunction, right? Who's actually paying is not the person benefiting. There are no real market forces to help a consumer differentiate between, is this the right price for this drug or not? Nor should we expect them to. But all of the ways that the market is structured that really lead to this, and doctors, and sometimes they might be incentivized to actually pick a more expensive drug depending on their reimbursement, but they don't have any incentive necessarily to pick the most cost-effective drug or a lower cost alternative because they're not paying for it. And so when it's this distributed, we're all paying for it through our taxes and our premiums, we end up with this system where the prices can just continue to go up. Now, the part that I know you have touched on in your podcast and your listeners are really familiar with is the pressure for the rebate and what has that done to the trends on launch price. And I think there are real examples of how that's been distortive to getting us to the fair price, the fair access paradigm. And we've had conversations with purchasers who are like, I would love to move to an ICER-based formulary where I just pay the ICER price, but I'm up against a brick wall because that's going to disrupt a lot of the ways the rebate game has been set up, and it makes it hard to change. And now there are also times when the rebate model gets us the lowest net costs when there's competition, which is a variation of the market actually working. And I think we've done a bad job of differentiating between the two. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to approach the way discounting is done in a way that isn't really kind of punishing patients for having to have a condition where there's a lot of these shenanigans.
As you know, Sarah, I'm a big proponent of the fair prices for fair access and sustainable innovation approach that your organization supports as well. But the marketplace has been so stuck. You know, the employers don't. You know, they kind of don't know enough to, in some respects, when they're shopping around and the details and all the, and who would expect them to, right? It's not their domain. And the rebates have become so dominant. It really has gotten in the way of, I think, you know, good decision making, and certainly the way we get to the rebates with all the formulary exclusions and aggressive utilization management, and even the high cost shares in some regards, create more distortions and more friction as well. It'll be interesting, you know, as you do your work on the launch prices and access, that you know, the access at launch for most products today is very poor, and it changes quite a bit over time, you know, depending on the particular circumstances. And so figuring out, you know, how to track that over time and how to make sense of that and report it over time, I think will be part of the key there as well. But given how stuck it is and how difficult it is for patients and doctors too, what do you see going on in the marketplace that, you know, might break through? Do you see anything that gives you hope, new ideas, new approaches, or something to unstick?
Yeah, some of my hope actually comes from a more cynical view of where we are right now. I do think there are incredible headwinds in the employer-sponsored health insurance market. And I think in large part, many employers are unaware of how bad it is. And I often reference the Wile E. Coyote cartoon where he's over the cliff, but he hasn't started to fall yet. And I just think that might be our employer-sponsored insurance market, because at one point you cannot keep absorbing 20% increases in your premiums year over year. At one point you just run out of margin, right? So the optimistic take on that is sometimes the policy window opens for more dramatic change when things get really bad. And again, not voting for that as the outcome, because It could be really disruptive to a lot of us who rely on our employers for the health insurance, but that's one policy window I see open. And so could we then see a rethinking of benefit design, the way we think about the price, the rebate, the discount, something that says, I'm going to commit to not offering high deductible. I'm going to commit to fixed copay, because there's a lot of new research, even from those who first said we should do the skin in the game, we should do the con share. They're like, you know what? Never mind. That was a bad idea. So do we get to rethink that and then say, well, then what do we need on the other side? Well, maybe it means that the hospitals can't increase rates more than the rate of inflation. And maybe it means we can't be paying well over the price that you can justify with the evidence that you've produced for your drug. And so is there an opportunity there? Maybe. More practically, I've been watching the disruptive PBMs and with fascination. You know that they're making some they're gaining some ground. They're getting new clients. They're trying to build up to have the market share that would help them make more significant change here. But I love the idea of administrative fee and full pass through and more transparency. I do think, to your point earlier, Scott, it's really tough for some employers because change is hard. And if you've had that, you don't want angry phone calls about having to navigate a new PBM or a new health plan. But I am watching that space with a lot of attention because it might be one of the ways out of this.
I have a follow-up on that. So, so that's been a great hope for, many years now, that the more transparent pass-through PBMs would start to take market share and change the market in some positive ways. It hasn't really happened. There are a number of them out there. They're gaining more attention. I know, it's been a year or two since I looked at it, but they had not actually been gaining market share overall. And in fact, the consolidated power of the big three was continuing to grow, especially when you threw in their GPO clients and that kind of thing. But I marveled sometimes why, the concentration really is a function of the industry contracting strategy, where it rewards, with deeper rebates, larger purchasers with higher control, implementing higher control. And there's a logic to that. But it's now 25 years or 30 years into that process. We have selected only for the largest and the highest control. And from my view, it's those contracts now represent 95% or so of the net price market for most products. And so really that price is kind of, as from a manufacturer, it's your net price in the market. And so why not offer that to the smaller ones that are trying to be more transparent and support access and those kinds of things? It hasn't happened. Or in your conversations with manufacturers, is there anybody potentially thinking about it differently that way, Sarah?
Yes. But here's another cynical take on where we are right now. And I promise to be more optimistic with some of the
part two of the episode.
Well, I think that one of the challenges is that there's a couple. And you know this much better than I do, Scott. Not all pharmaceutical companies approach this in the same way.
Sure.
There are pharmaceutical companies that are really interested in having a conversation about value and bringing the evidence and having the negotiation be based on some independent or empirical evidence. And then there are some that aren't interested in that approach. And one of the trends that I've seen recently, and this is kind of in the weeds, but a lot of the departments at big pharmaceutical companies that have experts in health economics and outcomes research have been decimated and reorged. And a lot of the power is now resting with the market access folks who have one lens, which is negotiating the rebate with the big three. And I get it. That has been a strategy that has been working for getting the formulary access. And so if I'm running a business, I understand. I get bummed out because when I seize the way out of this, it is a different approach to that negotiation and to that conversation. So again, a slightly cynical take, but one that I think represents a little bit of where we are in this moment. I had a conversation with a manufacturer who was saying that they really wanted to just give an upfront discount. They actually had data that their drug was better than like the market dominant drug. And they were disappointed to find out they couldn't give the drug away for free to get it on preferred formulary placement, right? Because they were getting the PBMs were doing just fine with the way that it was structured with the market leader. And so we can choose to do differently. One thing I'd like to see the pharmaceutical industry do a little bit more is talking about how the rebate model is distortive on a drug by drug basis. Right. We know that the it's out there talking about how we have to have higher list price, all these things. But I wonder if we need more of a public dialogue about, I would have loved to have given this drug for an upfront discount, and I really wanted a first tier, a tier 1 placement. Hey, and I also, by the way, I priced it in the ICER price range, and this is what happened. Right. I don't know that all the time public shaming is an effective approach to change, but I do know that right now, and I think many of the participants in this are kind of guilty of this, is that the way that we have been doing it is working really well for them.
We've always been a big fan of the fact that ICER took on the sort of the annual assessment of barriers to fair access report, right? Yeah. So big fan of that. Love what you're saying. Love your approach. But the report itself, I think patient groups are always looking at it saying, really, like you're giving them a better grade. I don't think they really deserve that passing grade. How do you begin to balance between sort of the patient's sort of real world feet on the ground perspective of the barriers with the payers, this report where the payers are coming out sort of self-reporting that they're providing access?
So what you write down in a policy that you can read is the extent to which we could judge, the policies versus our criteria. So there's a couple of things. We know that how it feels in implementation is something that we cannot read in a document. So how often did they reject the prior auth claim? Did they respond to an appeal within 24 to 72 hours? Did they actually have a clinically appropriate expert in the peer review? Or was there a pediatrician talking to a neurologist?
Or an AI doing something.
Yep, exactly. And you can't see that from sort of what's publicly available. I think the other thing is it's actually true that the majority of patients are actually doing fine with access because they're on a generic drug, or they don't have many multiple chronic conditions. It's what happens when you have multiple chronic conditions, you happen to have a condition for which there's an expensive drug, and you end up in that sort of specialty world, right? So it's 80% of our spend, and yet it's 5% of the people. I have those numbers wrong. You guys will know those numbers better than me, but I think directionally that's right. And then you hear those stories because those stories are pretty crappy. Like the mom who can't get access for her kid's epilepsy, and the person who had to switch from one rheumatoid arthritis drug to another and then had a flare up. And so we hear those stories, and it's one of the important rules of the patient advocacy community to help highlight those stories. But if you average that all together, given the way the number of people accessing the system is, there are a lot of people who are actually having pretty good access. And so that disconnect to me isn't an excuse by any means. It's more of an understanding of, well, here's where we can focus and do better. Maybe it's optimistic. Is, okay, we don't have to fix 95% of it. We have to fix 5% of it. So like maybe that's one way to think of it as an opportunity. And we did offer in our Barriers to Fair Access report every year any of the patient groups that we had worked with 2 years prior, because all the drugs in scope were drugs that we had looked at 2 years prior, the opportunity to share with us any data they had about access restrictions or stories of their patient community. And I think that has been powerful. One was actually an example of a payer that required the physician to submit documentation that the patient had the genetic mutation for cystic fibrosis every year.
It doesn't change. Yeah,
and it doesn't change. Not yet. Let's hope. Maybe. Like,
we're not doing gene therapy yet.
We're not doing gene therapy yet. And so that person's genetic code has not changed. And so at that point, you start to think that it is just about the paperwork. And the other thing I would mention is that we looked at the biggest plans in PBMs, and we looked at their standard policy for a particular formulary. We know that individual purchasers can have tweaks to that standard formulary and to the cost sharing and all of the other things. We didn't have any insight into that. We were looking effectively at what the fully insured sort of standard formulary approach was. And so this was our report was also an opportunity to really talk about the role of purchasers and even the responsibility of purchasers to also bring some fair access criteria to how they're thinking about their benefit design and their cost sharing. Because I don't know that a lot of people know that. They think it's, big bad Optum is making me pay this really high coinsurance. When in fact, it might be that the big self-insured employer made that choice for any number of reasons.
I'd just add that the, things like you mentioned, copay accumulators, copay maximizers, alternative funding programs where people are insured and then their child's diagnosed and then all of a sudden that drug, which was on formulary yesterday, is now off formulary when my child needs it. Like those are just bad practices. And I guess I would hope that there would be like an addendum or something in the report that factored in. And I know you're right; it's only 5% of the patients, but it is a important part of what our focus is and where we hear a lot of the issues.
I don't mean to just diminish the experience of the 5% either.
Right.
I hope that was not my intention. I think that the other part of this that we think a lot about when we're thinking about the framing and we're thinking about is that we have a lot of situations in how our health insurance market is structured around prescription drugs that we could admit are a symptom of a problem. And the problem has been higher and higher costs. And some of those costs are justified. We've done reviews where $3.95 million is actually a fair price for an effective gene therapy. It's not to say all the prices need to come down, but where we've seen the trends and the overreach, you can imagine a response from those who are trying to keep the per member per month down at year over year, that it's a symptom of a problem to say, and here's an alternative funding program that I can offer you, which we don't. It's important for the context. This isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening because of the entire way the ecosystem has evolved with the price and the access piece.
Yeah. And it's not just the drug ecosystem. It's the hospital and doctors. It's the whole expense in healthcare. The employers are desperate for relief generally.
They're desperate for relief. You're right.
It kind of doesn't matter whose fault it is. So with that in mind, Sarah, let's turn to the ultra high cost therapies. You've reviewed a number of the cell and gene and other ultra high cost therapies through the years. Those markets have not stabilized or not, worked as well, I think, as manufacturers and patients groups and providers originally hoped they would. What do you see evolving there?
I see more worry. I am worried we are screwing it up, and like we being the collective royal we. There are a couple of things that I see happening in this space. One is just what the science is. My first job in industry was working at Genome Therapeutics, which was a private site sequencing the human genome while I was there. We thought maybe in our lifetime, we might see a therapy based on correcting a genetic mutation. And here we are. It was science fiction back then, and now we have it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Okay. It's amazing. And as someone who saw the machines that were sequencing the human genome, I sit in awe of that often when I talk to the manufacturers, when I talk to the patients who've benefited. I worry that the science is way ahead of where we are as a society. I think there has been missed opportunities, and this is a collective, again, this is the royal we, opportunities for education, what gene therapy is, what it's not. I think that there are opportunities to think about where at this moment gene therapies make the most sense from a market and patient acceptance perspective. a potentially fatal neuromuscular condition versus hemophilia, which has patients who are really well managed and feel pretty stable on their current treatment regimen. So there's a couple of different factors there for me that are coming in on the patient acceptance and the sort of societal perspective piece. The other piece is, even though, and a shout out to the New Dix program at Tufts Medical School, who's been doing a lot of great work on this for years, our payment system has not evolved to think about how to pay for value all in one shot, right? We have a system that knows how to pay for chronic therapies every year. I'll negotiate the rebate. I'll do some things with my formulary placement. But all of a sudden, now I have a therapy in front of me that ICER says is fairly priced at just under $4 million because of all of the benefit that the patients get from one shot. And you expect me to figure out how to pay for that? I mean, we've been working on it, and there's lots of models out there about how to do this. And I just think that the payment system hasn't evolved. I do think we're right on the precipice of the payment system catching up for a couple of reasons. When there's 2 or 3 gene therapies, you think you could dodge the bullet. You think you could just handle it with reinsurance, right? You've got something. As soon as we get to 15, 20, 25, I think you're going to see the purchaser community sort of demand a better solution. And some of them are risk pooling, right? Joining a whole group with a fixed per member per month, get as much gene therapy as you need, some sort of budget certainty in exchange. So I'm optimistic that we're about to hit that sort of point, but it is a tough market right now, and the investment is going down, and that bums me out. The scientist in me would really be disappointed if it meant that we weren't continuing to think about how these technologies can have that one-time potentially curative impact for patients.
Again, you're right on target with that one in terms of, it's also some incredible miracles, right? This is science fiction come into our world, into our life today. But so I'm going to ask you to sort of put on your futurist hat here for a second and sort of look ahead and look out. And do you see, from ICER's perspective, are there things out in the future that you're excited about? Are there experiments? I know we already talked about value-based not getting the kind of reception that we'd like. But what do you see out there that could potentially be a new idea or something to look out for?
I think there's an opportunity for the pharmaceutical industry to lead in the value-based conversation in a way that some companies are doing, but others could sort of come along as a way to change the dialogue with payers and purchasers. I think that there's opportunities to lead by saying, I picked this price because, and here, you can see my math, not because I can. And I think that offers an opportunity for a different conversation. And so, of course, I'm giving you an answer to your question that just invites the opportunity for an independent assessment from a value assessment group to help you know what that price should be. Right. But I think I'm excited by the number of companies that are starting to tell their story in a more empirical way. I'll mention that when Eisai issued a press release of their cost effectiveness math for how they priced lecanemab, I was pretty impressed by that. And I thought we need more of that. And funny, we came to a similar answer. Our answer was a little bit different than theirs because we made a few different assumptions. And I would much rather have a conversation about how those assumptions were a little bit different and how we might think about them versus I picked this price because we can. So I think that's coming. And I also think it could be an antidote to some of the other access restrictions, drug price negotiation, some of the other policy options that might be on the table that aren't centered on paying for value. So I do see an opportunity here to really double down on the value question as a way to say, no, my price is justified, and we should figure out a way how to pay for that as a society, $4 million for a gene therapy, And maybe we can have a conversation about what the appropriate price and access looks like for the 20 drugs for rheumatoid arthritis. So I see that as the opportunity that could be coming that would really help on this fair price, fair access piece.
All right, Sarah. Well, listen, one of the great benefits of coming on the show here is that all of our guests get a magic wand. And so we're going to pass that magic wand to you now and ask what your advice would be, what you would like to see happen if you could do one thing to improve access for patients.
So the self-serving answer would be the one I gave about everyone using independent analysis of value to pick price. But I actually have another one, which is I would eliminate the ability for there to be lobbying donations to politicians.
Oh, interesting.
I think that at the end of the day, a lot of people want to do right by this tricky question of price and access and how we deal with affordability. And I think that there is too many conflicting donations at times that make it hard to do courageous change from the status quo, because a lot of people are doing just fine with the status quo. So my magic wand would be to actually eliminate the lobbying and political donations piece.
Interesting. We haven't heard that one before.
I was going to say, that's a new one.
Yeah. That's
I'm
good.
glad I got a new one. All right.
Yeah.
Sarah, that's wonderful. And thank you so much for joining us. And another benefit of being on this podcast is you also get Scott, my real-time reaction, Scott's real-time reaction about some of the key points and lessons learned. So first of all, I'm going to say, Sarah, you are a breath of fresh air. So I really think that that your perspective, I know you've been there a long time in the organization, but I don't feel like you've become I don't mean to say institutionalized like in a bad way, but you know what I mean? Like sometimes people that have been in an institution or an organization too long can just be sort of put blinders on. I don't feel that way at all. I'm really, really excited about the fact that you're looking much broader. You've embraced patients. You've embraced the change to your framework. You've embraced the understanding of what the challenges are related to access. And you've embraced also some sort of radical ideas about how things can be done. So I think all of those are really important, and from our perspective, I think important for all of our listeners to hear. And I will just sort of say that the last thing that I learned, which maybe it was in the report, the fair access, the barriers to fair access report, was how the policy is what ICER judges, and how that becomes such a difficult thing to look between the lines, to read between the lines, and again, but I do think that Sarah's the right person if there's going to be someone that's going to help do that, I think Sarah's the one to help lead ICER to do that, to start to read between the lines and make a difference for improving things for patients.
I'll add a couple of things. I've long admired Steve and Sarah and the ICER's organization ability to have a North Star and evolve their approach. I think they've been very good actually about listening to all the different stakeholders and trying to respond to that. I think that's a real positive for the organization, and I think Sarah continues to demonstrate that as well. I do hope that somehow the barriers to fair access work can be resurrected in a way that can be impactful in the marketplace. And I think that would be very useful. And I understand it's like a lot of these things, the technical part of the analysis is just challenging. I worry, like Sarah, about what's happening in cell and gene, and that we need a better approach to that. And I hope that she's able to contribute to that along with lots of other folks as well. I like the comment about eliminating lobbying payments. That was a fresh one, and it was
That's a
good.
new one.
And the other thing that struck me as we were talking here is, we ought to get together in another year or year and a half or so and follow up on the cell and gene thing, but also follow up on what's happening with implementation of the IRA and how that whole negotiation process has worked, and what's happening in the pharmacies and for the patients and those kinds of things as well. So anyway, always a pleasure to get to see you and work with you, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
You were both very generous to invite me on. I had an absolute blast. So thank you so much for bringing me on today.
Oh, that's great. And with that, we wrap up episode 26, the beginning of our third season of the Prescription for Better Access podcast. And we will have show notes as well as other ways to learn more about ICER and what they're doing. And as always, thank you to our listeners. If you have questions or comments or ideas for new episodes that you'd like to hear, please send an email to comments@prescriptionforbetteraccess.com. And thank you, everybody.